don't start small, start big when it's coming to AI, right? Now, I know it sounds counterintuitive, and I don't mean spend a lot of money and build a big system. What I mean, though, is that if all you do with a new technology is solve an existing problem slightly better, then the bar of proving that your new technology is better is actually much higher. It's like, oh, I've got something which is just as good. Why am I going to spend a lot more money and trust and capital, as in, individual capital, personal capital, arguing for this, or regulatory capital, trying to get the regulators? Why am I going to do that? I've got something. And this is one reason why image recognition and NLP has moved ahead, because there were no alternatives, right? Whereas you'd mentioned Moritz credit, I mentioned financial crime. Well, you know what? There's well-established statistical and rule-based algorithms for that.
Hi everyone, my name is Lauren Hawker-Zaffer and this is Redefining AI, a tech podcast that focuses on key narratives that drive digital innovation and help people understand artificial intelligence, machine learning, insight engines and the insight era. On this episode, I've been joined by my colleague, Dr. Moritz Müller, and Moritz heads the product team in Singapore. Now, Moritz and we have differing backgrounds, so I can really promise that this conversation does prove to be a rich one. And remember, if you like this episode, take a minute to rate it and tell us what you enjoyed. After all, we make the show for you, and we want you to get the best from it. So first of all, let's welcome Moritz. Moritz, welcome. Can you take maybe 5 minutes to introduce yourself before we invite our special guest onto the show today?
Hey, Lauren. First of all, thank you for inviting me to the show today with you. It's a pleasure to be back. I really appreciate what you do with your team, with Grow, for this show, because I strongly believe that education is key to whatever we do, especially nowadays in an era when everyone talks about AI. I think giving AI a bit of a meaning, a bit of a very concrete meaning, and not just speaking about it as a concept is very, very helpful. So a bit about myself. I'm here in Singapore. I have opened the office for Scroll in Singapore 2 years ago, and it has been quite interesting ride during COVID times. But now I'm focusing a bit more, of course, again, on the whole AI topic. It is very interesting to see how the field has evolved, how AI has evolved in the last 2 years. I think COVID was actually quite helpful to a certain extent, especially when we look a bit on the unstructured data side. There was suddenly a need for companies to evolve very quickly to deal with a lot of data. And it's quite interesting. And today we have a very interesting guest on the show. And I'm very much looking forward to speaking to him and speak with you and ask him some interesting questions.
Excellent. Yeah, we certainly do have a special guest. So thanks, Moritz, for that sort of introduction. Now, this episode, it's called What is Trust in AI? Trustworthy AI, Lessons of a Chief Data Officer. And it is a title that I feel obviously indicates the direction that we intend to go in today with our guest, Shameek Kundu. Shameek is the Head of Financial Services and Chief Strategy Officer at TruEra. So welcome, Shameek. It's really lovely to have you here with us.
Thank you so much, Lauren. It's a real pleasure to be on this podcast, particularly because I have long engagement with Squirrel, ranging back several years, and it's wonderful to collaborate on this very important topic from an educational perspective.
Excellent. Now, Shameek, you're in Asia, you're in Singapore, and you've been there for a few years now. Can you maybe tell us what's kept you there? Let's hear a little bit about you and your journey so far.
Sure. So I moved back to Asia, I suppose, having grown up in India. I moved to Singapore about 12 years ago when I joined Standard Chartered Bank, where I was Group Chief Data Officer between 2014 and 2020. So that's the professional angle. But I suppose you asked me, what's keeping me here. A few things. I think from a professional perspective, certainly, it's an exciting place to be, both in terms of how forward-looking some of the regulatory framework around the use of data is, and how much the potential of data, both structured and unstructured, is is all around us. Whether it is financial inclusion in some of the ASEAN and South Asian countries using new types of data, or whether it's pioneering in a lot of the use of facial recognition, etc., in a safe manner. I think it's always been at the forefront of technology, and more recently, it's also been at the forefront of technology-related regulatory and safeguard frameworks as well. So yeah, it's if you're into data, into AI, into digital more broadly, it's a fantastic place to be.
It's not a place I've been yet, but Moritz obviously understands because he's there himself, and it's where we have our office, Squirrel, in Singapore as well. So let's start diving into sort of topics that you've mentioned. People who are interested in data, they're interested in AI. So we've seen as well, Shameek, that artificial intelligence is all around us, not only in Singapore, but globally. And it's really rapidly transforming our livelihoods and the environment in a lot of fundamental ways. Now, building trust in AI has therefore become quite a key concern for policymakers, for the industry and science. Now, I mean, I think we want to find out, in your own opinion, when and where did this necessity for the narrative around trust in AI come from? And my main sort of question that pertains to that would be, how far is it from people just really engaging in abstract discussions about AI theories?
Sure. I think it's a really interesting question, and probably not one I would be confident in saying I have the full answer to, but I'll have a go. I think there are actually two different conversations here. There is a conversation about the use of AI in what is very much the public domain. And this is, among other things, social media, search engines, e-commerce related pricing, advertising. All of these things are, entertainment. All of these things are impacting a very large number of people and use a significant share, though not all of them, also involve the use of natural language processing, image recognition in some form or the other, and often at the bleeding edge of some of the newer machine learning techniques. That's where the experimentation often happens and is realized. In that realm, the conversation on trust in AI came from fear. It came from the fear of, oh, we've seen some of the ill effects, let alone AI. We've seen some of the ill effects of not knowing who's accessing what data and doing what with it. We've seen the effects of that. And before the horse bolts this time, let's make sure that we build a framework so that similar misuse of these newer algorithmic techniques does not happen. Now, one can argue whether the horse is bolted, but that's certainly that angle of fear. And I say that fear because there is some genuine reason there, but unfortunately that means that some genuine fear is also combined with a level of kind of exaggerated fear for things that are not even on the horizon, right? So that's one block. There's a separate block of largely traditional enterprises, banks, insurers, pharma companies, industrial firms, etc., who have a different trust challenge in AI altogether. Yes, they do have some of these concerns about fairness, about not misusing customer data, and so on. But the bigger concern, as an executive at a steel plant once told me, he said, "Shameek, you worry about fairness and what social media can do. Imagine if I use machine learning to set the temperature of a blast furnace, and that goes wrong. Imagine the cost of that, right?" So this is a different fear, but it's not necessarily a fear. It's, well, I'm not going to use AI in its fullest sense until I have the trust that this works at least as well as my alternatives. So this one, I mean, whether you call it a fear or not, but this requirement is much more one of, I need to be able to prove and test that this thing works as well as my alternatives, because I do have alternatives, which may not be as complex or which might use other techniques. So there are these two conversations. Now to your question on timing, I think the first conversation started 4 or 5 years ago. I don't know where to draw the line, but somewhere between Cambridge Analytica and some of the issues around Facebook, and all of those fears got combined in one, and the additional surveillance around the pandemic, probably data, AI algorithms, mutant algorithms, in the words of the British Prime Minister, they all became one big blob, and that's been around for 5 years. This other conversation on the enterprise side, it's a newer one. It's a much more subtle conversation. This is trust, not about, oh, you're not going to do unfair things to protected segments alone. It's much more fundamentally, I'm not going to use this stuff unless I'm confident that it's better than what I have. This conversation is only now maturing, I would say, in the last 2 years. And people are still feeling their way around it, around how best to draw a parallel between this and traditional software testing, for example. Because at the end of the day, machine learning provides software. So we do software testing. How's this different? How does this fit with software certification, similar aspects? And so that conversation is probably the last 2 years.
Mm-hmm. Maybe a question following up on that, and especially one that pertains to more the narrative or conversation that's happening in traditional enterprises. Who's involved in that conversation and who's not involved, and maybe who should be involved? And
it differs by organization. I know in one bank, the Trustworthy AI group started with a monthly meeting of 10 people, and at last count had 150 people attending from across the bank. That is not great. That basically means a lot of people are worried, and they're just trying to kind of make sure they're there because they might miss something. But generally speaking, who's at the conversation? I think in some of the more mature organizations, everybody who needs to be. So in the industry that I know well, banking, who all are at the table? Obviously, the analytics teams, the people who are building the models, the model sponsors, those who are commissioning. Like if you are a retail bank head and you're starting a new algorithmic lending program, then you want to make sure your model is working well. The specific control functions that are designed to address data and model risk. These are two different organizations in banks often. They're involved. Sometimes compliance organizations focused on what in banking is called customer conduct, which is how do you treat customers? Do you treat them fairly? To some extent, security people, and so on. So all of these parties get involved. Sometimes ESG or corporate communications people, just to focus on that aspect. What do we communicate to the rest of the world? And I think most of these are at the table. The one group that I think was not at the table until recently, and they have come on board now, is actually the technology platform owners. Because for a long time, they have focused on the efficiency of the process to build models, deploy models, implement them, monitor them. This particular aspect of testing the quality of it has been something, well, before you bring the thing into production, you would have tested it. But that's not how it works in a large-scale industrialized world. But I'm very pleased to say, actually, increasingly, our conversations at TruEra now are more and more with these platform owners these are technology architects, technology delivery people, sometimes business people who are heads of AI centers of excellence and have the task of giving a common platform to everybody else. And now those individuals are realizing, you know what, if we leave this to a lot of human beings to figure out, you'll have 150-person meetings. We need to build this in an automated fashion so that these considerations get addressed the same way software testing gets addressed.
Of course. One thing that might be key to the conversation, and I don't necessarily want to make a polarity between fear and trust, but we're talking heavily about trust and trustworthiness and trustworthy in AI or trustworthy AI. How would you personally define trust in AI, just so that we can baseline the conversation and ensure that our listeners attach themselves to your own definition?
Yeah. So I would say at its basic, does it do what it says on the tin? Number one. But then number two, derivative question, does it actually say on the tin what it does?
So I was going to ask that.
Right. So these two probably are the basic piece. And because it is machine learning, it's also, does it continue to do over time what it said it would do? And also another variant, does it do so for every group to which it is applied. So it might have been saying, I will do X, Y, Z for this group of people, but now you might have applied it to somewhere else. And so can that be applied? If you cover these four rather folksy questions, I think you will cover every aspect of ethics and bias and everything else. Because more often than not, the reasons people find mutant algorithms is not because somebody, I do not know a single person who went in and said, I'm going to design a really sexist or racist algorithm, right? It's ridiculous. Even a sexist or racist person will not say, I'm going to go to the trouble of designing one, right? What I have seen is people having no clue what the original model was meant to do or where it was meant to be used with what limitations, and now going away and applying it somewhere else without actually adjusting. I'll give you a simple example. Facial recognition, East Asian country, bought the model from another East Asian country, which was racially very uniform. Almost all the people were East Asians. Introduced in a city with much more of Caucasian and South Asian mix. Suddenly not working as well, right? They didn't set out to be racist. They just didn't realize that thing cannot be transferred straight away. So let's retrain the model a little bit with this. And that was it. No grand designs of let's do a really bad job of making South Asians and Caucasians unhappy. Just we didn't think about the transferability. So coming back, does it do what it says on the tin? Indeed, does it say what on the tin what it does? And does it continue to do so over time and over different groups to which it is applied?
Understood. So question now from my side, Shameek, because I always try to understand in terms of trustworthiness, what are the drivers, right? I think the biggest worry on my side when I see this is not necessarily having a bias. You will always end up having biases, right? Even if you try to avoid them, there might be one and then you start correcting them. I think it's very much a question of reputation. The moment you have something out there that actually works perfectly well for 99% of the cases and has a 1% bias, you might, and that goes into the news, you have a huge reputational risk. And I think that is, for me, probably from my perspective, if you look at compliance and the corporate point of view, this is probably the biggest worry that there is, that you run into a situation where you have a public scandal, let's say it that way, right? And it might just affect one person and work fine for a million, but this is something to be avoided because it will also avoid going forward adoption of AI. And we are, no matter what we do, we will adopt AI solutions more and more. There's no alternative to this. I think we agree on that. Mm-hmm. Now, my question to you is a bit, if you look at that trustworthiness, you have the corporate perspective. And for me personally, maybe, I'm happy to hear your perspective. You have much more experience there. And it's not only reputational risk, potentially there are other effects and components. And then on the other side, you have the regulator. The regulator tried to set a framework. But where do you see some of the key differences and motivations when you look at the regulator defining some of those trustworthiness frameworks, let's call it that way, compared to the motivation on the corporate side? Is it only publicity risk? What else is driving these people to define those frameworks?
Yeah, I think you made a very important distinction, and it kind of goes back to that fear versus trust thing that we started with, right? I don't think, though, that the split is really between regulators and corporates. I think the split is between people who fully understand what this beast is and what its full set of risks are, versus those who have mostly worried about it superficially and therefore think only about that one article about Apple or something like that. Don't get me wrong, there's a lot of unfair bias out there. But the logical conclusion from a large defensive enterprise will be, well, if it is risky and we can't do anything about it, let's just not use it. And you said, well, there is no alternative. Actually, there is alternative. They will use humans. They will use traditional. In many cases, traditional models work well as well, right? Some places they can't. In NLP image, they can't. But many other areas they will. So I think there's a little bit of there is that split that you mentioned, but it is not between regulators and enterprises. It is between those who've understood AI quality as the holistic problem, just like software quality was a problem years ago, versus those who are still looking superficially at this ethics and bias issue only. the individuals and the regulators and the corporations that have understood this problem as a holistic problem around performance, stability, fairness, privacy, security, robustness or fallback, all of these aspects, that's one group. And the other group is primarily those who are like, oh, this is all about reputation. Because then they're not understanding the real problem. Now, with that in mind, I don't actually think there's a big difference between where the regulators' minds are. And I do work, as you probably know, with quite a few regulators across Singapore, UK, now a little bit in the US. I actually think the leading regulators and the leading adopters of AI are exactly in the same place, right? There are differences in terms of kind of supervision, in terms of how deeply the regulator might want to give out the question paper, so to say. But fundamentally, if you look at the EU AI law, for example, the draft, it is not talking only about ethics. It is actually talking about all those aspects of quality. And so I think the difference is not necessarily there, Moritz. I think the difference is there. That difference exists, but it's between people who've understood the problem fully versus people who've just scratched the surface.
Thanks a lot. I completely see where you're coming from, Shameek. So that's why we invited you today, and we very much appreciate your view on this. And of course, I think you're right. It was more of a also a tricky question to look at the motivation. Now, you at TruEra, you are committed, of course, to building trustworthy AI. And you mentioned already a few factors that are part of a trustworthy AI solution. But are there one or two components that you think can potentially be forgotten and that should be that we should remind people to look in and to guarantee that they have certain procedures in place to honor those when they build AI solutions?
Yeah, and it's a really good question. So let me start with the ones that everybody agrees upon. I think everybody agrees upon some degree of obviously performance, as in predictive ability, how accurate it is in testing, but also on an ongoing basis. I think everybody now agrees on picking the fairness aspects, although there is less agreement on which ratios to use, which is a whole area of science by itself. A lot of people are agreed about the need to respect privacy while using AI. So these are all common agreements. There are two areas that I think are like second, third order pieces. One is the use of the AI human interface. So let me give an example. Often people will say, oh, don't worry, I have a safeguard for that particular model. There's a human being who's reviewing the results of the model and deciding whether to go ahead with it or not. Now, I've run many of these projects and systems. 200,000 instances, 20 instances when the human supervisor disagreed with the machine. Now, what happens when those kind of numbers happen? After a while, you do what that Tesla driver who had the accident on autopilot happened. So that area of, oh, I'm saying I'm giving the human power, but actually, am I? Because the human is slowly getting lulled into thinking, this thing knows what it's doing. Why am I even bothering? So that's an area that I don't think people have cracked. There's a lot of research going into this, but that is one area. The other area, Boris, is interplay of models. And I think your company's work will be quite relevant. Suppose you use Quiro to generate insights from unstructured data. And that might be good enough for a human relationship manager or a human expert to review and say, okay, you've just saved me work for reading, but now I'm going to do my own things. That's one angle. But there's a completely different angle. If the data that you've generated, structured data generated from your unstructured text, now gets fed into something else, which then gets fed into something else. And before you know it, you have a chain of 3, 4, 5 models. And those interdependencies, I think some companies have started talking about it in their internal policies. But I don't think that's been fully understood. And by the way, neither of these problems, Moritz, neither this one nor the previous one on human interaction, is actually unique to AI. Because you can have the same issues with statistical models. You can have it with very complex rule-based models where, oh, it's so complex, I don't understand. Machine is saying, approve this, I'm going to approve. Or, well, that machine had a rule book this thick. I added another rule book this thick. By the time I go to the third machine, there's no way of knowing what's happening. So I think those second-order complexities are less well understood. One that is somewhere in between is the interplay between security and trust. Trust implicitly includes security, but we increasingly have situations where people are worried about things like data poisoning. So in security breaches that impact the outcome of the AI, particularly with self-learning models. I mean, there are people looking at it, but it's still not that well understood, I would say, that particular area.
One thing that we've not touched upon there is maybe the actual data that's used. Do you think there's a difference in explainable AI when it comes to maybe the data set used of unstructured or structured? Is there anything that leads to or that's critical for maybe more fairness or bias reduction in that sense?
I mean, I think that first of all, it's very apt to think about data because ultimately, I mean, in theory, you could get a model wrong both due to design choices you make, like technical design choices, hyperparameter choices, etc., as well as data problems. In practice, we find the vast majority of issues happen because of data problems. So first of all, it is right to focus on data. Thanks for bringing us back to that, Lauren. To your question, what are the differences between unstructured and structured data? I think the advantage with structured data, particularly if it is data that was already inside your enterprise boundaries, is that you know roughly what that data is. So you know how to assess whether that data is good or bad, and therefore you are able to put a little more control around what is feeding the engine. The problem with unstructured data is even if you've had it in your organization for a long time, you have no conceptual framework on how to decide whether that data is good enough or not. And I think that is the real problem. That it's not that the question is, the exam question is the same in both cases. Make sure the data is representative and high quality, which might mean everything from complete and no dummies and so on. But the way in which you implement it, the tool sets for managing data quality and data representativeness are far better established, in my view, in traditional structured data than with unstructured data. And that is where I think the challenge, but also the value of vendors like Squirrel come in, because it's an area that hasn't received the same amount of focus. So you're solving as much a data problem as you're solving an AI problem. Whereas with a lot of the structured data, the data problem somebody else is solving, the software is just solving the AI problem.
I think it's a very good point that you make, Shameek. And maybe just to reflect on how we have experienced this. Like you mentioned it before, and I think this is spot on. There are different layers of AI, or like when we talk about layers, if you start to apply AI on different levels, and later on you combine those respective information or outputs of the model into something bigger, that is potentially where the risk is coming. We have seen this when we do our news analytics, independently what models we use. If we use some rule-based models or if we use NLP models, that we can easily detect interesting components to show, for instance, a relationship manager saying there's a sentence that talks about potential capital raise or an M&A event. We can do this. And if you show this to a relationship manager or to someone that reads and still makes an educated decision, is this something that is useful? Can I take that forward? Can I take that up? Do I have an idea when I see this? I think in this case, the risk is limited, or risk of having trustworthy components limited, because a user always understands potentially why this is now highlighted. If it's useful or not is another question. But if you combine this later on, let's say you take, we call those signals or insights that we extract from this. If you combine this later on, that you have two of those and two of those insight signals, you look at the cash, for instance, from a client, the cash balance available, and you start doing predictions or recommendations. This is the reason where you come into a field there where you need to be careful, because at the end of the day, you need to explain it. And for me, this is the explainable part. You need to actually then explain what are the underlying data points. Mm-hmm. And you need to explain also your model in that sense. You just need to say, look, what I had were two text indications and one structured data point indications. And we have set up very often doesn't even need to be AI, or just a rule-based model on top of something that is machine learning, that pinpoints it then into the direction to saying, now, bring this up as a recommendation, or do not bring this up. And as long as you can explain it, I think that's helpful. But very often, for simplicity reasons, or because it's also overwhelming to really understand the whole value chain there, we leave this out. And for me, this is where the risk comes into play. So maybe then to just add on a question to you, Shameek, have you seen an AI project that has failed because the value chain of AI was not transparent enough?
I think I've seen tons of AI projects fail, but I'm not sure they will quote the reason as that. You see, they will quote the reason as the performance went down. It was good at the start, but then it went down, or it was good, but the data quality was bad over time, and that's why I didn't use it, right? Or occasionally they might say it was too complex, right? But really, if you go into each of those, there is an element of this trustworthiness. They just won't necessarily call it trustworthiness. So why did the model go bad over time? Well, if you had set up good monitoring of the drift and the root cause analysis of the drift, you would know why it's going, and you would have that warning, and you would self-correct, or you would put up a red flag and say it didn't work, right? There was one instance in a company I know where the model worked very well. It was a self-learning model. So in 3 months, all the easy hanging fruit was gone. I was like, now we don't need it. The rule-based model is very good. Yeah, it only became good because of the learning from the first piece, right? And so that might be fair. So to your question, have I seen AI projects fail? Not just me. I think there's a lot of literature and surveys out there about the percentage of AI projects. Some people say 75%, some say higher, that actually not necessarily fail, but that fail to scale up. I think downright failures have happened. There is a well-known article or meta article on how bad machine learning models were in predicting things around COVID. I think there was like a meta study done on that. There is, of course, before that with one of the major tech firms, there's this whole piece around how bad it was for cancer detection, even though initially. So there are some big instances of failure, but I would say there's 1,000 instances of failure to scale up. And that failure to scale up comes because what might work in the context of a small project with 3 people who are all looking at that topic does not work when you're trying to scale it up to 300 people. And those people don't have the same knowledge, same context. Now you want to industrialize it. That is where I think a lot of the failure happens.
Yeah, a very good point. When you evaluate then AI projects or risk AI projects, I think that's what you do at TruEra as well. You advise on potential risks. How do you evaluate in that sense the complexity? Right, complexity is complexity a key component of the risk evaluation that you do?
It is. I mean, just to clarify, we don't actually provide advice, but yes, our software does the testing, which can then be used to draw the insights. It is and it isn't. What I mean by that is, look, you can have. In my career now, it's a long time ago. In my career, I've been in a situation where we got fined several $100 million for a very simple fuzzy logic model. Okay, nothing to do with AI, not complex at all, right? And then I know of deep neural networks that have worked with remarkable accuracy. So I'm slightly wary of saying complexity equal to bad, right? But I think complexity left as complex without an attempt to test it, without an attempt to, abstract out what it's doing. Right? It's not always, you don't need to understand exactly how the image recognition model worked. As long as you say, actually, I have such robust testing, I test it every day against different populations, so I'm not worried. So I think complexity in itself is not bad, but complexity left increasingly as a black box, which has not been answered and is not understood and is not tested, that is bad. Unchallenged complexity is bad, but complexity itself is not bad. And I think there is evidence of that, right? I mean, there's evidence of how most recently I saw an example of people in February this year in the US. I think one of the regulators said, oh, we're very worried about algorithms misvaluing, if that's a word, or undervaluing certain properties for mortgage assessment because of race and other consideration. And then 2 days ago, I read this article from New York Times, which I don't know the factual accuracy of it, but from what it looks like, there was a human evaluator who did exactly that with a black family evaluated at $450K. The guy got a white colleague and their family to come and stay in the house and remove some evidence of their race, and then suddenly apparently it became $750 with a evaluator. Now the reason I give that example is a potentially complex machine learning model with a lot more data points might have been able to do a better job than that very simple option of let's just give it to a evaluator. So complexity does not equal bad as long as you have the ability to explain and put safeguards around it.
No, I think you're spot on there. That was also my point, right? My point was more, I was hinting at complexity being a risk for a project. I mean, from my experience, and that goes more in then the perspective of cognitive understanding of the solution.
Yeah.
I have seen, for instance, banks working in computing with AI credit risk scores. And for these credit risk scores, it's really key that they are trustworthy and explainable, because what I've seen then, and I know a project, big corporate bank has invested millions in this. At the end of the day, they brought it live to the corporate bankers. And they ended up not using it because they didn't understand it. They didn't agree with it.
Yep.
They had a feeling for the client. They didn't agree with the predicted scoring because their feeling was not in line with what the machine predicted. And that's what I meant with complexity, right? That you have a certain risk when you start doing this. That if the adoption is not there, right? It's also much more the risk of the stakeholders. If the adoption is not there, it's a big investment risk that you face.
Yes, so, there's that as well. Yeah, there's absolutely big investment risk. And so maybe I will stop with that and then move on to the next question. Somebody asked me recently, what do you think is the biggest risk in this AI space? And I said the biggest risk in this AI space is of people not using AI at all at scale because of the fear of all the risks of AI. Because I think there is that angle that, so it is for that reason that we need to crack this problem, because if we don't crack this problem, you might get into another AI winter over time, certainly in traditional enterprises.
Everything's just been so fascinating. I'm learning so much myself, and I actually wanted to ask you as well, just the same question that Moritz brought up there around the cognitive understanding and obviously challenging the human and building up trust in the human. But I think what I want to do just before we sort of usher towards the close of our conversation is, Shameek, obviously you have had a lot of experience, and we've seen that displayed in our conversation today. I mean, you were the Chief Data Officer at Standard Chartered Bank. You also mentioned that at the start for many years. Actually, probably the longest serving, I think, CDO in a global systematically important bank. And as you personally claim, from what I've read, long enough to see both the hits and misses of your own and your team's efforts. And I think your role was sort of full range across data strategy, architecture, technology, governance, curation, data dictionaries, metadata, standards, golden sources, and analytics enablement. 2014 to 2020, was obviously an interesting time to be a CDO. Maybe as a part in thought, what are your two top lessons learned from that period that we can really share firsthand with our listeners?
Sure. I mean, first of all, before I share that, I said, I think, yes, I did claim that, enough to see the hits and the misses. I would say there were more misses than hits, right? And for sure. And so, yeah, you asked for two. I could give you 10 things that you shouldn't do. But let me focus on two. One of them is counter to actually, both of them are counter to what I started off with, but I've come to the reverse conclusion. The first is, don't start small, start big when it's coming to AI, right? Now, I know it sounds counterintuitive, and I don't mean spend a lot of money and build a big system. What I mean, though, is that if all you do with a new technology is solve an existing problem slightly better, then the bar of proving that your new technology is better is actually much higher. It's like, oh, I've got something which is just as good. Why am I going to spend a lot more money and trust and capital, as in, individual capital, personal capital, arguing for this, or regulatory capital, trying to get the regulators? Why am I going to do that? I've got something. And this is one reason why image recognition and NLP has moved ahead, because there were no alternatives, right? Whereas you mentioned Moritz credit, I mentioned financial crime. Well, you know what? There's well-established statistical and rule-based algorithms for that. So that is my first takeaway, which is, if you are really trying to demonstrate the power of AI and kind of really get an organization to adopt that, then the traditional logic of let's start small and get a few wins and then we'll get there, it sounds attractive, but then 5 years later, all you have is a few small wins, right? Which is not helpful. That's number one. I think the number two is very appropriate for this this conversation. Is the power of education is too light a word, but it's the power of taking the broader organization along with you. When I started as CDO, Lauren Moritz, I had a sum total of one staff member, one. When I finished in 2020, I had 2,500. Okay. Now I quote that because this is an area that has grown enormously, both in terms of dollars and people and interest from boards, from regulators, etc. And all these people are at different levels of capability, I want to say, but also different levels of understanding. You might think, or I might think, as a data professional, I know everything there is to know about data. But maybe the person I should be listening to is not a data professional. Maybe I should be listening to somebody, like you said, Maurice, to a relationship manager and say, actually, data is useless unless I can use it. So I would say my second big lesson, and my mistake, if you will, the flip side of that, was I focused too much on saying, let's get to a technocratic solution and get the right solution. I mean, so if I bring it back to the AI trust thing, I am 100% confident that anybody who understands data and machine learning will quickly be able to understand that this model is reliable. Well, that counts for nothing if the other 99 people who are meant to use the model, pay for the model, swear by the model in front of the regulators, audit the model, get impacted by the model as a customer. If those people are not convinced, what's the point of me and my technocratic friends being convinced, right? And so that would be my second big lesson, which is do not underestimate the power of taking the rest of the organization, your staff, your colleagues, your partners, all of them, and indeed ultimately your customers. Do not underestimate the power of taking them along if you want to, unleash the full power of AI.
Definitely, I would fully agree with you. And you see that there's a lot of conversations obviously being ushered around, the people in digital transformation and taking the broader organization with you. But yet you still see high statistics around those that are still failing to take the organization with them. So where is the blocker, or why, or what's the incapability around really being able to take? Does it pertain to the size or the maturity of an organization? That
Yeah, it's a tough one.
Very much so.
Yeah, I would say the biggest single reason is it is a hard problem, and it's hard not because of some mathematical difficulty. It's hard because what makes it hard? It makes it hard. A few things make it hard. One, as I just mentioned, you are trying to take a large organization along with you on a relatively technical topic when everybody is at very different levels of understanding. The same is not true, let's say, for remote working. Everyone has a say on remote working. Well, everyone may or may not have a say. As an example, I'm just taking, right? Ways of working is something that everyone can contribute to meaningfully without having to do a lot of technical reading up, etc. So one thing is the differing levels of knowledge, awareness, mindset across the organization. But the other thing, Lauren, is also, I think, the lack of maturity of data management as a discipline. It's only recently that data management frameworks have come about. It's only recently that vendors like yourselves have kind of taken a more systematic approach, for example, to unstructured data. And I think it's fair to say both yourselves and us, we're still learning. We're still putting the framework together. You compare that with something like software engineering, which is now much more mature. I think the thinking has also not matured. So I would say these two reasons come to mind, but I doubt they're the only ones. I think data is all around you. It's pervasive. And so to say we will get everybody aligned on something on which everybody might have an opinion is always going to be difficult. But yeah, I think more systematic approach towards training, as well as more automated mechanisms, recognizing that doing all these things in isolation in a small cottage industry is not going to work. You need to do it in a way that is scaling up. I think those things will help, but will it solve the problem? I don't know. When I started as CDO, Lauren, I said, we won't have a CDO role in the future because you no longer have a chief electricity officer, do you? After all these years of having electricity. I am only seeing the number of chief data officers increasing every day. So I want to say I'm pessimistic about that, although another part of me says it's great that may the tribe of CDOs grow, is what I would say. But at the same time, it does mean the problem is not yet cracked by any means.
Yeah, it's an ongoing one, and it's something that I'd certainly pipe in the sense of education can only enhance the understanding from every angle.
Yeah.
It's been wonderful, and I'm sure Moritz, you will join me in sort of thanking Shameek today for his contribution.
Absolutely, it was fantastic. Shameek,
it's been a delight to speak to you. Sorry, please.
The danger is that we could have been ongoing now for a while. Share some stories and learnings. I think you brought it very much to the point. There is so much data out there that the only way to tackle this going forward is technology, in that sense AI, whatever it means. And it's a hard nut to crack, but it's definitely worth trying. So we are very happy to be part of that whole machinery, that being part of one of the guns that is aimed at the big amount of data out there. And it might be a bumpy ride, but at the end of the day, I'm pretty sure there is value out of what we do. And there's a huge potential of standardizing it. And I think you and I and us in general are part of this journey. And it will be interesting to see how this evolves in the next 5 to 10 years.
Absolutely. So I can only wish you that Squiro's gun keeps firing away. And I can only thank both of you for this wonderful opportunity. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So I want to thank you. I want to thank everyone else for listening today. It's really been a wonderfully insightful conversation. If you want to learn more about AI, ML, and search, come and take one of our free courses at learn.squiro.com.